I am Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant, and you find me once again here in the library, and I welcome all of you who have seen fit to join me. Tonight, I would like to reflect on my relationship, or lack thereof, with President Andrew Johnson after President Lincoln was assassinated and he assumed the White House. Now, when we had negotiated the surrender with Lee, the President and Congress heartily approved of that. And then, of course, on the 14th and 15th, President Lincoln is shot, murdered, and dies, and Andrew Johnson from Tennessee becomes the president. And we still had in the field a number of Confederate forces and armies, but Sherman had brought Joe Johnston to bay in North Carolina. He had assured me that he would do the same surrender terms as I had given Lee. But as I recall, it was on April the 18th, we got the message. Major Hitchcock, I believe, brought the terms from General Sherman that he'd given General Johnston, and Sherman had turned the world upside down. He'd done anything but what he told me he'd do. He had agreed to terms with Joe Johnston that the Confederate troops could march back to their respective state capitals and stack their arms and arsenals, that the state governments that were then in force would remain in force, their constitutions and property rights and so forth. Well, of course, that was unacceptable because, in essence, it ensured the continuation of slavery and was of great consternation. President Johnson and Secretary of War Stanton, as was the whole cabinet, very upset, and I volunteered to go to North Carolina and talk with Sherman and tell him this was unacceptable, which I did. In fact, I took my private car only as far as Raleigh and had Sherman come to me, and I told him it had to be reworked. He wasn't surprised. He'd been reading the newspapers. But the problem was that Stanton had accused him of being a traitor and had released the terms to the newspapers, and the press was awash with condemnation for Sherman, and I was extremely upset about that. I perhaps dare say as much as Sherman was, being called a traitor and so forth, to be treated that way after what he'd done for the country. But he came back with the same terms I had given Lee. Now, when I got back to Washington, I actually wanted to go into Mexico. We had 1 million men under arms, and Maximilian had set up a puppet government in Mexico, backed by his cousin Napoleon III, who wanted to get France back into world domination, starting with Mexico, and had been threatened to come in on the side of the war with the Confederacy, and been a real thorn in President Lincoln's paw and subsequently mine. And I wanted to go into Mexico. President Lincoln didn't want to do that. President Johnson didn't want to do that, and Secretary of State Seward was counseling against that. Don't start another war with France. And I acquiesced, but I did send Sheridan to Texas and got an army of 50,000 men there on the Texas border and in Louisiana. I told Sheridan to work with Benito Juarez, the leader of the Republicans for the Mexicans, and give him whatever aid he could. So he ultimately saw to it and got to Juarez 60,000 rifles, which was a godsend. It kept the Republicans in the fight. They had much of northern Mexico under control by then, and I was consistently pushing in cabinet meetings with President Johnson about supporting the Juaristas, and Secretary of State Seward was equally as opposed to that. He said we need to be diplomatic. I brought it up at several cabinet meetings. We need to go into Mexico. And I told President Johnson that not going into Mexico while we had a mammoth standing army would be a mistake, because later we were going to be in a war with Mexico and France, and it would be much bloodier and more expensive. And then again, to counterbalance that, Secretary Seward was saying, no, don't. In 66, ultimately Napoleon pulled out. Maximilian was shot by a firing squad, and it turned out the diplomatic way to go was, in truth, the way to go. But we were dealing with Mexico at that time. Now, back here in the U.S., May 23rd, 24th, we had the Grand Review. And the second day, when the Western Theater marched, Sherman went to the reviewing stand, shook hands and embraced President Johnson, and coldly, intentionally ignored the extended hand of Secretary of War Stanton, who had called him a traitor in the New York Times and other newspapers. And then Sherman is off to help me control the Indian problems and multiple problems occurring around the country. But right after the Grand Review, President Johnson began what has become known as presidential reconstruction. He issued his amnesty declaration, and he shouldn't have done that. I counseled him against that. Congress wasn't in session. It was unilateral on his part and was not going to be good. There were a number of exceptions, I think 14 exceptions, and those not covered, or those in the exceptions rather, they could appeal to President Johnson individually, which he wanted to do. He changed his mind about that when hundreds of Confederate officers and politicians began knocking on his door, but he would personally approve pardons for the soldiers and the politicians in the Confederacy. It was a colossal boondoggle for President Johnson. And then when Congress came back in session in December, it became very heated. And that's when I got caught in between Congress and President Johnson. Now, I should outline for you what President Johnson wanted. He had grown up very poor in East Tennessee, and in fact didn't even learn to read and write until his wife taught him when he was 21 years old. Got a substantial success story from learning how to read and write at 21 as a tailor to becoming a Tennessee governor and senator, and ultimately now, through a gunshot, the President of the United States. But he intensely disliked wealthy people. He wanted, in his Reconstruction, to do away with the Southern aristocracy and the wealth and have a society, actually I suspect Jeffersonian, craftsmen, workmen, laborers, and do away with the white privileged upper classes. Now, Congress, the radical Republicans, wanted, and he wanted to punish the South. He said treason must be made odious. He still wanted to punish the South, but he wanted to do away with the aristocracy. Congress, though, Thad Stevens in the House and Ben Wade in the Senate and Charles Sumner in the Senate, they wanted to make the South howl. They felt that the heel of the victor should be on the neck of the vanquished. And they wanted to punish the South. I didn't want to punish the South. I didn't want to do what either party, Johnson or Congress, was wanting to do, and I was really trying to stay in the middle. And as it turned out, I wasn't able to do that. Now, in the summer of '65, President Johnson sent Senator Carl Schurz, German immigrant, had been a general in the war, political appointee, on a tour of the South. And he comes back from his tour and wrote a 46-page report that really criticized conditions about oppression and blacks, newly freed slaves, how the black codes or laws were being rewritten, how the South was reshifting and filtering back to what it was. Very critical report. President Johnson didn't care for that. So in late August and September, he asked me to go to the tour of the South, and I went. In fact, I went in civilian clothes. But I was duped in that tour. I toured the South and went to Kentucky, Indiana, the Carolinas, Tennessee, came back, and I made my report that they all seemed pretty well happy with the situation and being back in the Union. So President Johnson in November of '65 released both reports, hoping mine would offset Schur's. When I saw Schur's report, I realized I'd been duped. In fact, later on, when I was able to speak with Senator Schur's, General Schur's, I apologized to him and told him I had been misled and had been fooled into doing something that President Johnson wanted to do, and the people I saw knew what was happening, and I was just gullible in that effort, and sincerely apologized to him. In December of '65, December the 6th, I think it was, the 13th Amendment was ratified and it was approved, I think, December the 18th. So slavery was officially dead. The next move that the radicals wanted to do was to get a civil rights bill out. So going into the spring of '66, Congress passed a civil rights bill, and they also passed a renewal of the Freedmen's Bureau, which actually I had started back at Shiloh with Chaplain Eaton back in '62 to help the newly freed slaves transition to freedom. And Johnson wanted it stopped. He was dismayed when I supported it. He vetoed both bills, the Freedmen's Bureau bill and the Civil Rights Bill. He lacked 2 votes in the Senate, or the Senate lacked 2 votes of overriding the veto. They promptly overrode the veto of the Civil Rights Bill. It's significant because it's the first legislation, major legislation in our history that was passed over a presidential veto. But Congress was determined to get these civil rights approved for these newly freed slaves. Well, President Johnson also is wanting all of the federal troops out of the South. And I counseled him against that. I said that for the protection of blacks and whites both, the governors and the military commanders for the Reconstruction, the military divisions, are all telling me, do not pull out these soldiers, because it's just not safe. The South is not ready to be unsupervised, if you will. And we have to remember, the South was conquered. It was not convinced. Well, Johnson still wanted them out, but a matter of particular angst for the South was that about a third of those soldiers were black troops. Now, they were just 6%, I think, of the Army before the war was over. But between April of '65 and November of '65, we went from 1 million men under arms to 270,000, then down to 183,000 by the end of the year of 1865. So we're flushing out troops as fast as we can to get them off the payroll. Now, when we did that, the black troops made up 36% of the troops on duty. And that was galling to the Southerners, the ones that were trying to overthrow our control and bringing them back into the Union. Another issue with Johnson and the Congress was Johnson felt like the South had never seceded. President Lincoln held that opinion. They haven't seceded, they're just opposed to us right now, I believe is one way President Lincoln expressed it. And President Johnson was saying we don't need to go through a reconstruction, we just need to have a rejoining of the states. That didn't sit well with the radical Republicans. They wanted the South to go through all manner of complications and jump through hoops. one of them being the ratification of the 13th Amendment, and then the 14th Amendment when it was introduced in 66, as a part and parcel of their getting back in the Union. Now, when April the 6th of 66 came up, the Congress overrode the veto of the Civil Rights Bill. And I had a party at my home that night, Julia and I did, and of all things, President Johnson came. He never went to anything at night. And Thad Stevens came. He never went to anything at night. But they all came to my home. One of the guests there was Alexander Stephens, the former Vice President of the Confederacy, and a number of other Confederate leaders. I had that guest list because I wanted to show we've got to come back together. And while there was some shock upon people seeing who else might have been there, it was a good evening for everybody concerned, I believe, and it was my and Julia's statement, we've got to come together. Now, June the 14th, the 14th Amendment was passed in Congress and in 66 and went to the states for ratification. The May the 1st and July 30th of 66, we had riots in Memphis that went 3 days, 46 people killed, 150 seriously injured. New Orleans, there was a black suffrage meeting, and white troops and white league militia attacked them, killed another 40, 50 people, wounded another 100, 150. It was an outrage, both instances, and I told the president those efforts were a stain on the national character. He agreed but didn't do anything about it. And I instructed my military commanders to arrest criminals, people committing violent acts, if it appeared that the civilian authorities were not going to do it, and hold them until the civilian authorities would take action and take these people to trial. And we did. And that eased up some of the angst, but not much. It was worsening. Black codes, which essentially put the freed slaves back into a legal system of servitude, sharecropping being the first situation. It was getting worse and worse, and I was pulling away from President Johnson and more toward Congress and their approach, although I didn't care for either one. I wanted peace and healing, and neither approach was going to bring that about. And I was deeply, deeply concerned. The final break for me with President Johnson, well, there were two instances. One was what came to be known as the swing around the circle. When the 14th Amendment was sent to the states, President Johnson vehemently opposed it and was urging states not to ratify it, which indeed many southern states did not ratify it. And he had the entire cabinet and myself and Admiral Farragut to go with him, and he went to 2,000 miles in 3 weeks to cities from Washington to Buffalo, New York, back to St. Louis, and it was galling to sit there. And he wanted Admiral Farragut and myself flanking him on the stage, so we were by association supportive of his programs. We were not. By the time on September the 8th, when we got to St. Louis, he got into a heckling bout with the crowd, and they said, "Why don't you hang Jeff Davis?" And he said, "You want to hang Jeff Davis, huh? Well, why don't we hang Thad Stevens and Wendell Phillips, who was also an abolitionist in the House? Hang them, because one traitor at the end of a rope is just as good as the traitor at the other end of the rope." Unacceptable talk. And I begged off. I said I was sick, and I went back to Washington City. That was the beginning in the fall, President Johnson wanted to send me to Mexico on a diplomatic mission, and I refused. He wrote, had Secretary Stanton write me, give me the directions, and I replied I wouldn't go, and went to a cabinet meeting, and the cabinet meeting began, read the directions for General Grant, and I said, there's no need to read that. I'm not going. And President Johnson then turned to the Attorney General and said, could you tell me if there's any reason why General Grant would disobey what I told him to do? And I, by this time, am outraged. I stood up and I said, you don't need to do that. I'll tell you why I'm not going to do that. Because that's a diplomatic mission. Now, as a soldier, any military order you give me, I will happily obey. But this is diplomatic. It is beyond my expertise. It is beyond the scope of my duties as commanding general, and I'll not go. I turned squarely to face him. I said, no power on earth can force me to go to Mexico. And amidst the stunned silence of the cabinet meeting, I left. Now that was my final break with President Johnson. What he wanted to do, and he had told me, send for Sherman to come to Washington. And I knew what he was going to do is send me to Mexico, remove Stanton from office, put Sherman in, or possibly have Sherman in my stead supporting Stanton being removed. Well, Sherman wasn't going for it either. He came to Washington and told me everything the president told him. And we put the stop to that. I did not go to Mexico. Sherman went to Mexico, as it turned out, on a failed mission, which was another reason I didn't want to go, because I didn't want to be hung with a failed diplomatic mission to Mexico. And if it was successful, Secretary of the Interior or Secretary of State Seward would get the credit. So I was in an inescapable quandary and was not going to comply with that. So as 1866 came to an end, we had the elections. The Congress, Republicans won overwhelmingly, 2/3 majority in both houses, so they could easily override any veto of President Johnson, which they did frequently thereafter. And they began what they called congressional reconstruction. So as we go into 1867, I have great concern about how the second 2 years of the Johnson administration is going to fare. I already have had an open break now with President Johnson. There is acrimony in the air between us, and in fact, I see him as little as possible. And so far as I can tell, he does not seek out my presence either. But that is where I should stop at this time, because that's in the middle of Johnson's presidency. We're getting into 1867 now, and I think I've laid out the situation. Oh, and I will conclude with this. July the 25th of 66, Congress passed the legislation creating the rank of General of the Army. Brand new rank, came with 4 stars instead of the 3 I now wear as Lieutenant General. And I was very pleased, although I realized why it had been done. President Johnson wanted to court my favor, and Congress wanted to court my favor. So he had suggested it. They soundly, roundly approved of it, and I emerged from the fracas between the two of them, Congress and Johnson, with a brand new rank, General of the Army, July 25th of 1866. So, as I had said a moment ago, I shall conclude my remarks there. We're halfway through the presidency, and in my next reflection about my relationship with President Johnson, in part 2 of Grant and Johnson, I'll talk about what happened in 1867 and 1868. I think that there were some interesting developments. Perhaps you will as well. So at this time, I will take my leave of you. Thank you for joining me here in the library. And I would tell you that I look forward to us coming together again for Grant and Johnson, Part 2. So for the moment, I'm Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant, bidding you a fond adieu.